Welcome back to the Kuhn 100 conference organized at the University of Bucharest jointly by the Department for Theoretical Philosophy and the Humanities Division of the Research Institute. I should mention that the keynote speakers for tomorrow, Hasuk Chang and Han Andersen, apologize for not being able to make it today because of objective reasons, but I'm delighted that Theodore, Arabatzis, and Alexander Bird, our keynotes for today, are with us. And it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce Theodore Arabatzis. He's our first keynote speaker for the day. Professor Arabatzis is coming from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. He is a long-standing friend. He has given Cherfis talks before. And today he will be speaking to us about Kuhn and the prospects of philosophical history of science. Theo, thanks again, and please take it away.
Thank you, Andre, for the kind introduction, and many thanks to you and Dana for inviting me in this very nice conference. So I will start with a quote from one of my favorite novelists, Julian Barnes, which I think can be used to indicate Kuhn's achievement. Here's what Barnes said in a book called Levels of Life, titled Levels of Life. You put together two things that have not been put together before, and the world is changed. People may not notice at the time, but that doesn't matter. The world has been changed nonetheless. Other things being equal, I think captures Kuhn's achievement. He put together a history of philosophy of science, and the academic world has changed since then. My late teacher, Jerry Gison, used to say that The Structure of Scientific Revolutions is a book worth rereading once a year. With each new reading, one is bound to discover a new insight about science, and I would add, one is also bound to raise new questions about the character of this revolutionary book. 60 years after its publication, structure remains as intriguing and hard to categorize as it was when it first appeared. No less an authority on the book's character than its own author, even Kuhn himself, had trouble classifying it. Here's a quote. Asked what field structure dealt with, I was often at a loss for response. Recently, Ian had raised the question, is the book history or philosophy, without addressing it directly. So what kind of intellectual work is structure, given that its ideas are drawn from a variety of fields not normally treated together? Clarifying the book's interdisciplinary character may help us better understand and hopefully strengthen the troubled relationship between history and philosophy of science. Structure, more than any other recent work, opened up space for HPS as an integrated project, notwithstanding Kuhn's later claim that there is no such thing. Structure raised novel questions, for example, about the nature of scientific discovery or the character of scientific development, that required an interdisciplinary approach. Neither historical research nor armchair philosophical reflection by themselves sufficed to address those questions. Now, those questions that I mentioned could be tackled only through a combination of historical interpretation and philosophical analysis. Historical scholarship and philosophical argumentation had to be brought under the same roof. In what follows, I will do four things. First, I will discuss some ways in which history and philosophy of science are intertwined in structure. Second, I will briefly sketch the history of HPS after structure. Third, I will point out some possibilities for HPS opened up by structure, which, however, have not been sufficiently explored in the subsequent career of HPS. Finally, I will reflect briefly upon one of those possibilities, what I call philosophical history of science. HPS in structure. Structure, according to Kuhn himself, was a rich blend of something resembling philosophy, these are Kuhn's words, and history. The relationship between philosophy and history of science in Kuhn's work has been extensively discussed and remains a controversial issue. The focus of the discussion has been on whether Kuhn's extensive use of historical examples provides evidence, sufficient evidence for his philosophical claims, or whether those claims were meant to stand on their own. While this is an important issue, my concern here is rather different. Namely, I plan to look at how Kuhn brought his philosophical acumen to bear on the historiography of science. Before I discuss this, however, let me mention two uncontroversial points in the literature on Kuhn and HPS. First, it is widely agreed upon that Kuhn's philosophical reflections on scientific practice were elucidated and made plausible by discussions of historical cases such as the Copernican revolution or the discovery of oxygen. Conversely, on the basis of Kuhn's philosophical insights, such as the incommensurability of competing paradigms or the extended character of scientific discovery, those episodes were seen in a new light. Another uncontroversial point is that there was a direct link between Kuhn's experience as a historian and his philosophy of science. The notion of incommensurability, for instance, was motivated by Kuhn's difficulties in interpreting historical sources. Here's a quote from an interview that Kuhn gave towards the end of his life. Incommensurability is a notion that for me emerged from attempts to understand apparently nonsensical passages encountered in old scientific texts. Ordinarily, they had been taken as evidence of the author's confused or mistaken beliefs. So Kuhn's realization that there was a conceptual gap between older modes of thought and contemporary science was in tune with the so-called new historiography of science, which ruled out anachronisms and retrospective evaluations of past scientific practice. These historiographical maxims were particularly prominent in the work of Alexander Koyré, whom Kuhn deeply admired. Structure was put forward as an articulation of the image of science that was implicit in innovative historiography. Kuhn's account of scientific development provided, in turn, a powerful philosophical explication and defense of Koyré's non-presentist historiographical approach. In particular, the notion of incommensurability captured the conceptual and axiological distance between older paradigms and their contemporary descendants. Thus, it lent philosophical support on the resolve of historians to avoid contemporary concepts and values when interpreting past scientific beliefs and practices. So Kuhn's philosophical work has to be examined and appraised in close connection with his practice as a historian of science. Despite his later ambivalence towards interpretations, I think that there was under Kuhn's historical and philosophical work. He wore both hats, the historians and the philosophers, all the time. The historiography of science further by Kuhn's philosophical vision. Philosophical themes such as the theory-ladeness of observation and Kuhn's emphasis on the role of epistemic values in theory choice set new, previously puzzling features of life such as the existence of protracted disagreements among scientists. Kuhn did not just draw upon historical scholarship to score philosophical points. Rather, he employed the philosophical tools he had fashioned in order to illuminate key episodes from the history of science. So, for instance, on the basis of his philosophical analysis of scientific discovery as an extended process, Kuhn developed a novel approach to the discovery of oxygen. In the older historiography of the chemical revolution, which dated back to the 19th century, the discovery of oxygen was attributed either to Joseph Priestley or to Antoine Lavoisier, depending on the national loyalties of the chemist historian. In either case, those attributions presupposed that scientific discoveries are precisely datable events that can be credited to particular scientists. Kuhn argued that this presupposition blocked the historical understanding of the emergence and consolidation of the oxygen theory of combustion by raising unanswerable and misleading questions about the date of the discovery of oxygen and the identity of its discoverer. Kuhn suggested instead that scientific discovery involves the development of a novel theoretical framework which inevitably spans a prolonged period and is a collective achievement. This explains why many scientific discoveries cannot be exactly dated or exclusively associated with individual scientists. So Kuhn's meta-historical conception of discovery gave rise to a more sophisticated understanding of the discovery of oxygen. This could now be seen as the outcome of an extended and controversial process of experimentation and theorizing that involved isolation of a constituent of atmospheric air and its conceptualization as a chemical element with distinct properties. Incidentally, the question of who discovered oxygen, Priestley or Lavoisier, now lost any appeal it might have originally held. Let's move now to HPS after structure. In post-structured developments, we can discern two main strands of HPS: the familiar historical philosophy of science and the less familiar philosophical history of science. The former addresses general epistemological and metaphysical issues about science in light of its historical development. The latter explores particular historical episodes while taking into account philosophical considerations about, say, the dynamics of scientific theories or the processes of conceptual change. If we look at the history of HPS with this distinction in mind, it doesn't take long to realize that HPS has been dominated by the first strand, that is, historical philosophy of science. History of science has been used as a source of data for generating and evaluating philosophical accounts of scientific development. And this goes back to Kuhn himself. In structure, he suggested that, quote, theories about knowledge should be subjected to the same scrutiny regularly applied to theories in other fields. In that spirit, he drew upon historical scholarship to motivate and support his model of scientific development. Other philosophers of science, most notably Larry Loudon, challenged the descriptive adequacy of Kuhn's model and developed alternative accounts of scientific change that would be better supported by historical evidence. Loudon put forward a whole research program aimed at testing philosophical theories by historical facts. The book on the slide, the cover of the book on the slide, is the outcome of that project. Now, in that confrontation model, and this is a very useful term introduced by Yuta Sikore, the confrontation model of the relationship between history and philosophy of science, history of science was seen as a repository of facts for testing theories of scientific change. This approach to historical philosophy of science is now passé, primarily because there are grave doubts that historical evidence can be sufficiently detached from philosophical theories so as to be used in their evaluation. Furthermore, history of science has been brought to bear on salient philosophical issues such as rationality, relativism, and realism. This is very familiar territory, so I will go over it very, very fast. In the 60s and 70s, historical episodes of theory change were discussed in connection with the rationality of scientific development. The philosophers who contributed to that literature were, for the most part, interested in retrospectively justifying the outcome of past scientific episodes in light of philosophical accounts of scientific change, such as Lakatos's methodology of scientific research programs. Kuhn, on the other hand, complained that philosophical case studies of that nature confused ex post facto philosophical justification with historical explanation. So it is no wonder that historians of science remained indifferent to historical philosophy of science so conceived. They didn't see any added value in that enterprise and were repelled by its normative and retrospective character, so they stayed clear of the debates over HPS. Kuhn, however, took part in those debates, but was opposed to what he called the amalgamation of the two fields. In 1968, he gave a lecture on the relations between the history and the philosophy of science, where he argued for a one-way traffic between the two fields. That lecture was subsequently published in The Essential Tension in 1977. Kuhn argued that history of science is relevant, actually indispensable, to philosophical reflection on science. However, the converse is not the case. Kuhn thought that analytic philosophy of science, the philosophy of science at that time, had little, if anything, to offer to the historian of science. Continental philosophy of science, in Kuhn's view, was equally useless. As he stated in that same lecture, quote, "There have been philosophers of science, usually those of a vaguely neo-Kantian cast, from whom historians can still learn a great deal. But I recommend these authors for what they saw in historical materials, not for their philosophies." So the philosophies are not historiographically relevant or useful, but those philosophers' historiographical perspective is what is important according to Kuhn. What I find curious is that Kuhn did not discuss the potential relevance of his own philosophy of science or that of his fellow historicist philosophers of science to historiographical practice. As I will suggest soon, there are philosophical insights in Kuhn's work that have significant historiographical value. If we move to the 1980s and 90s, that's a period that extends to today, we see that history of science enters the realism debate. Historical case studies of entities that have dropped out of the ontology of science, such as phlogiston and caloric and ether, were used to throw doubt on convergent realism, namely the view that science has been progressing towards the truth about nature with a capital T. Ever since history of science has occupied a central stage in philosophical discussions on scientific realism, and you see on the slide a collection that came out on that very topic that came out very recently. Now, why do I mention this? Because I want to make clear that even in this area, even though history and philosophy of science were brought closer together, all the action was on the philosophical side. Historians of science kept a safe distance from those debates, perhaps because they had already distanced themselves from the image of science associated with convergent realism. In particular, the realist tendency to view older scientific theories as imperfect versions of contemporary ones was, and still is, anathema to most historians. So far, I have looked at HPS from the point of view of philosophers. What about the historians, though? Whereas Kuhn's structure made evident the philosophical stakes in the history of science, the historiographical relevance of philosophy of science has remained rather dubious, to say the least. To many historians of science, philosophy of science, in Jet Buchwald's words, still lacks pragmatic value. Kuhn's narrative of scientific development was not well received by historians of science, who have been skeptical of his generalizations and have not adopted his terminology and conceptual apparatus, the familiar terms like paradigm, normal science, crisis, revolutions, with the possible exception of the notion of scientific revolution, to describe and explain how the sciences have developed. It is indicative of the historian's continuing indifference to Kuhn that only one major history of science journal, Historical Studies in the Natural Sciences, has devoted a special section on the 50th anniversary of structure. Sociologists of science and intellectual historians, on the other hand, have been more receptive to Kuhn's message. Nevertheless, it would be fair to say that Kuhn's book has influenced substantially, if indirectly, historiographical practice. Historians of science have learned from Kuhn, among other things, to appreciate the losers in scientific revolutions and see them as rational agents that resisted the new ideas and practices, often for good reasons. Furthermore, Kuhn's approach to science as a practice shaped by tradition, involving tacit knowledge and depending on rigid forms of training, has stimulated historical research and has been substantiated by several historical and sociological studies. Let me now move to the next section, Kuhn and philosophical history of science. What morals about HPS can we draw from the structure of scientific revolutions and its early reception among historians and philosophers of science? Kuhn's classic work offers a spectrum of possibilities for integrating history and philosophy of science, each possibility blending philosophical analysis and historical interpretation in a distinct manner. On the philosophical side, there is little doubt that history of science can cultivate philosophical intuitions and function as a source of insights about the epistemology and the ontology of science. In the 70s, McMullen made that point, and more recently, Sam Sindler has also argued along the same lines. An engagement with history of science can cultivate a sensibility to the complexity and variability of scientific practice, which have to be accommodated within an adequate philosophical account of science. On the historiographical side, and this is a point that I've been arguing for some time, philosophy of science can stimulate and enrich historical work. In the subsequent history of HPS, only some of those possibilities have been explored in depth, mostly those related to historical philosophy of science. HPS has been, for the most part, a philosopher's game where internal history of science is put in the service of philosophical theorizing. I think it is high time to redress this imbalance and further develop philosophical history of science by exploring how philosophy of science can be involved in historical interpretation. Philosophical history of science, as I conceive it, aims at understanding the scientific life in terms of philosophically articulated meta-scientific concepts, such as, for example, scientific theories, scientific models, epistemic values, experiment, and so on. By actively drawing upon the philosophical literature, or let's say epistemic values, philosophically inclined historians of science may shed new light on familiar scientific episodes, and in the process refine and modify the philosophical tools that they use. I see Kuhn's book, Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, as the founding work for philosophical history of science in the above sense. In that respect, the importance of that book did not lie in Kuhn's grand narrative of scientific development. As I already pointed out, although this narrative may fit some historical cases, it has not been taken seriously by historians of science who, for the most part, have moved away from big pictures of scientific development and towards small-scale analysis of particular developments. Rather, the significance of structure for philosophical history of science rests on some of Kuhn's insights into scientific practice. In the interest of time, I will focus on two such insights: incommensurability and the role of epistemic values in theory choice. These insights are part and parcel of Kuhn's liberal conception of scientific rationality, which has led to a more sympathetic understanding of the losers of scientific controversies, who can no longer be seen as irrational holdouts, obstinately resisting scientific proof. Despite the fact that there is no Kuhnian school of history of science, several philosophically inclined historians of science have enlisted those aspects of Kuhn's philosophy of science in the service of historical analysis and interpretation. So incommensurability, very briefly, some comments about incommensurability. It's a Kuhnian notion, and it has been deployed to interpret various debates, from the wave theory of light to recent particle physics. Jed Backwald, for one, employed Kuhn's taxonomic approach to incommensurability to conceptualize the development of 19th century optics and electromagnetism, and argued that Kuhn's philosophical framework can deepen our understanding of the developments in those fields. More recently, Ha-Seok Chang has made use of incommensurability to the late 18th century tradition from a phlogiston-based and oxygen-based chemistry. Chang argued that the proponents and the opponents of phlogiston had incommensurable methods, epistemic values, and problems. One can thereby understand why the controversies around phlogiston were so difficult to resolve, and why phlogiston chemistry persisted well into the 19th century. So Chang's work, I think, shows the historiographical fruitfulness of incommensurability, a notion which Kuhn considered his main contribution to philosophy of science. Let me now move to epistemic values. In a seminal article, Kuhn set the problem of theory choice on a new basis. Rather than conceiving theory choice as a rule-governed process, as was common at the time, he emphasized the role of epistemic values in the appraisal and selection of scientific theories. Kuhn's values were not original. They included empirical accuracy, wide scope and explanatory power, simplicity, internal consistency, compatibility with established knowledge, and fertility. Kuhn's originality consisted in his suggestion that, in practice, the application of those values to the appraisal of scientific theories is extremely complicated. This is due to three reasons. First, those values do not wear their interpretation on their sleeves. Different scientists may interpret them differently. This is most evident in the case of simplicity, which lacks a universally accepted definition. But even in the case of prima facie straightforward values, such as empirical accuracy, disagreements may arise about the degree of accuracy to which a theory or method should aspire. Second, and more important, the hierarchy of these values is not unanimously agreed upon. Some scientists may attach more weight to, say, simplicity than to empirical adequacy, and vice versa. And there's a very nice example of this from the early history of experiments with electrons, when Walter Kaufmann, a very well-known German experimentalist at the time, when he made experiments with fast-moving electrons, he argued that those experiments indicated that the variation of their mass with velocity did not conform to Lorentz's and Einstein's predictions. Lorentz, for one, thought that his theory had been refuted. Einstein, however, dismissed Kaufmann's results as indecisive. Stressing the intuitive character and the simplicity of his theory, he considered its probability, and these are Einstein's words, so high that Dr. Kaufmann's results have every chance of being flawed. So faced with its choice to retain the theory, a simple theory, and throw away the facts, the experimental facts, he decided to retain the theory because of its simplicity. A third problem, in actual scientific life, epistemic values are rarely satisfied unequivocally. Consider, for instance, explanatory power. A theory may do a better explanatory job than its competitors in a certain domain of phenomena, and a worse explanatory job in other domains. According to Kuhn, this is precisely what happened in the chemical revolution. Here's a quote. The oxygen theory was universally acknowledged to account for observed weight relations in chemical reactions, something the phlogiston theory had previously scarcely attempted to do. But the phlogiston theory, unlike its rival, could account for the metals being much more alike than the ores from which they were formed. One theory thus matched experience better in one area, the other in another. From a Kuhnian point of view, one may easily understand the protracted disagreements and controversies that are often found in scientific practice. But by taking into account the complex interplay of epistemic values in theory appraisal, those features of scientific life can be plausibly understood as consequences of the epistemic uncertainties that are endemic in science. Kuhn's list was not meant to be exhaustive. Philosophically inclined historians may want to add more epistemic values, such as unification or completeness, to the Kuhnian repertoire and employ them in investigating episodes from the history of science. In any case, Kuhn's analysis of the interplay of epistemic values in scientific practice suggests a capacious framework for understanding past scientific life. In contrast with Lakatos's and Laudman's methodologies, which aimed at justifying retrospectively the judgment of what they call the scientific elite, the philosophical resources provided by Kuhn do not necessarily vindicate the winners of past scientific controversies. Kuhn's work indicates that philosophy of science can be historiographically employed in an interpretive rather than a vindicatory mode. Philosophical concepts such as epistemic values can function as interpretive resources for the historian and help her or him to illuminate the epistemic complexity of the problem situations faced by past scientists. Philosophically equipped historians may thus develop a sympathetic perspective on the losers of scientific controversies and come to appreciate the reasons for resisting theoretical novelty and their being left behind by mainstream science. Philosophy of science in the interpretive mode is thus fully compatible with the historical imperative to maintain a critical distance from the scientist's perspective on the history of their fields. To conclude, Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions got philosophical history of science off the ground by suggesting a rich repertoire of meta-scientific concepts for describing and interpreting the scientific past. Philosophically inclined historians of science may, and indeed have, fruitfully framed their narratives and analysis of particular historical episodes in terms of those concepts. In my mind, this aspect of Structure's legacy has outlasted Kuhn's famous grand narrative of scientific development and will continue to enrich the historiography of science for years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Theo. And I'm sure everyone in the audience joins me in using the applause button. Thank you. And now it's time for Q&A. If you have questions for Professor Arabatzis, please make yourselves known either by commenting in chat or by raising your virtual hand, or if you're coming in with video stream, by just doing something, and I'll take note of that. So if I may, let me break the ice with a very simple-minded question. The philosophical history of science. You're an advocate of this project, and one initial undergrad question might be, why is that controversial? Why isn't any history of science philosophical? Why is that an edgy project, and who are the holdouts? Thanks.
I won't mention names. Why is it controversial? I think because of, I mentioned some possible reasons. This, I think, has a lot to do with the uneasy relationship between history and philosophy of science. Historians of science are not very much inclined towards philosophical issues, or at least they're not inclined towards philosophical issues in the way they have been addressed by philosophers of science. I think, though, that if we look at more recent philosophy of science that focuses on scientific practice and has taken very much into account, historical development of science, the more recent historiography of science, and so on, it is much less objectionable than earlier analytic philosophy of science. So I think that part of the problem has to do with the lack of sufficient communication between the two fields, and the fact that many historians of science are not aware of the recent development of philosophy of science as a field. The other problem, another problem may have to do, it's a substantial problem, and I'm not sure that I have a good answer to a good solution to the problem, is that historians of science insist on historicizing everything. Okay, so the idea of using contemporary philosophical categories to understand past scientific practice is suspect, to begin with. My response to that would be that inevitably, we use present categories. They may not be philosophical, they are historiographical, they are sociological, they are psychological. We can't avoid that. There's no Archimedean point. And part of that repertoire should be, philosophical tools, I think. This doesn't mean that philosophical tools are written in stone. They may change. We may have to revise them if they turn out to be inadequate for understanding particular episodes. But I think it's much better to do that in an explicit fashion than to use some implicit philosophical categories without really being aware that some philosophical predilections, to use a neutral term, are embodied in our narratives. I don't know if I've answered your question, but it's a very good one and a very tricky one.
I think you have, and it's worth pursuing this more, but I see there's another question from Professor Jarobena. Dana, please go ahead.
I also have a question that is a bit marginal to your talk, Theo, but this relates to Kuhn as a historian of the scientific revolution. And reading the structure again, as you're saying every year, I'm getting more and more persuaded by the fact that the general framework of his kind of reconstructing the scientific revolution is merely a coherent framework. There's nothing, there's nothing added somehow to Coire's presuppositions about the continuation of astronomy since the ancient times and so on. Would you agree with that? How would you reflect on that? And Coire's Koire is a very, as you said, a very philosophically oriented history of philosophy, and with a strong flavor attached to it, not necessarily what Kuhn might have wanted to do, but somehow he seemed to have taken the Koirean picture of the scientific revolution with capitals this time on board completely.
Thank you. This is a really interesting question. I think that Kuhn's philosophical insights in a way go beyond or transcend his early work on the history of the scientific revolution. You probably have in mind Kuhn's Copernican evolution, right? I mean that book, which was published 5 years before Structure, and in some ways, I mean, there are elements of his later philosophy of science in that book, but in other respects, it's a quite traditional book. And what distinguishes Kuhn's historiography and his later philosophy of science from Koire is his emphasis on practice. Koire was very much a historian of ideas, and he wanted to, I mean, he advocated, practicing history of science as history of theories, basically, or history of ideas. And science and philosophy were just two aspects of the same thing for Koire. And I think there is much in Kuhn's philosophy that goes beyond that, even if he didn't practice that at the time. But we see that he did that later. I mean, if you look at his historical work on the quantum revolution, I mean, the emphasis on practice, on paradigms, on exemplars rather, on model solutions to problems that are taken up by later researchers. His emphasis on incommensurability, on conceptual shifts, they are all there, but they are not in the Copernican revolution. So I would agree with that assessment. And the historiography of the scientific revolution has come a long way since the 1950s. And Kuhn's work may seem a bit primitive from our standpoint, but I think that his categories, his philosophical and historiographical categories have outlasted his early historical work. That would be my response.
Right, thanks so much for the question and answer. And there's some more questions, comments, rejoinders. Lydia, hello. Go ahead, if you have a question.
Yes, good morning. Hi, thanks. And so I guess it's not the morning in some places. Yes, good evening also. So I had a question about Kuhn's position and structure about the relationship between history and philosophy of science, because I wondered whether your talk is arguing for a kind of widened conception from the one that Kuhn himself seems to argue for. I wondered whether this is something that, whether you're saying that he, in effect, has more to say about a philosophical history of science than he himself says in Structure. And the reason I say that is that in Structure, he says there's a sort of specific role for philosophy when there are revolutions in science and when the conceptual categories completely change. But then you're picking up on also this idea that, well, we might be talking about, as you said at the end of the talk, we might also be able to talk about epistemic virtues and weighing theories when they're being used in normal science. And so is this a kind of extension from the Structure picture towards the later? I guess that's my question.
Well, let me first thank you for attending the talk. I mean, it's very early in the States.
Yes.
Now, in the Structure of scientific revolutions, Kuhn doesn't really talk about the relationship between history and philosophy of science. This is not an issue that he takes up explicitly. At some point, he says that and you may remember the quote that I showed you, that epistemological theories should be tested against evidence, against historical evidence. So in that respect, they are like scientific theories. So it's an early version of the confrontation model in terms. But apart from that, he doesn't say much about the relationship between the two fields. In a later paper that was published in The Essential Tension, he takes up this issue explicitly, the relationship between history and philosophy of science. And as I said, I mean, he's very negative about the whole thing. I mean, he obviously thinks that history of science is philosophically important, but on the other hand, he thinks that philosophy of science is historiographically useless. And of course, the question comes up, what philosophy of science? I mean, Hempel's philosophy of science, his colleague Hempel's philosophy of science, the logical positivist, the philosophy that, epistemological topics of explanation or confirmation as those problems are timeless and independent of particular periods, particular fields, and so on. So in that respect, I would agree with Kuhn that type of philosophy of science is not very relevant. But what about Kuhn's own philosophy of science? He never raised, he never discussed. I don't want to part, because as you know, he was not very kindly treated by philosophers of science, and not very kindly treated by historians of science either. So his historical work wasn't very well received. I mean, if you look at his work on the quantum, I mean, the initial reaction was fairly negative. I mean, people like Martin Klein didn't think that there was much new in it, and so on. So there might be a psychological dimension here, but I don't want to go into that. So the point I'm trying to make is that regardless of, or despite of what Kuhn argued, I think that there is space for philosophical history of science. Okay, and Kuhn's own work has opened up space for philosophical history of science, and that there is a great deal of work in contemporary philosophy of science that could be brought to bear on historiographical practice. Epistemic values, epistemic virtues is an obvious area where a lot of interesting work has been done, and not just about epistemic values, as you know, but other kinds of values, moral values, political values, and so on. And these philosophical issues, I think, are relevant to understanding what is going on at the level of practice, because values enter scientific practice, and it's not enough to just do empirical work, but we need a conceptual framework, and to my perspective anyway, to think enough about this issue.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks so much to Professor Patton for the question, and to Professor Arabatzis for answering. If there's some more comments, rejoinders. Well, let me interject a quick follow-up of my own. I'm unsure. It seems as though it's a follow-up to all the questions you've received so far. So let's see how that goes. I'm wondering if, in terms of its philosophical fecundity, there's a difference between Kuhn's different works. And so whether, since we're also celebrating the anniversary of structure, naturally you focused on that. But I was wondering whether you think, you mentioned some works in The Essential Tension. Obviously, there's a lot of philosophical import in the Rhodes and structure. So I was wondering if you'd care to comment just briefly on the differences between Kuhn's different works in terms of how they might be sort of hijacked or exploited in various branches of philosophically informed historical discourse. Thanks.
Again, that's a really interesting and difficult question. I think that, and I'm familiar with a great deal of Kuhn's work, but I have thought about its historiographical potential only selectively, to tell you the truth. So he did some really interesting and pioneering work on measurement, the history and epistemology of measurement, on thought experiments. I used his work on scientific discovery and in commercial and conceptual change. His later work on incommensurability it's useful because it focuses on language, exclusively on language, incommensurability of problems or incommensurability of values. So it has a more narrow focus, but on the other hand, it's much more detailed and philosophically deep because he tries to unpack ability as a phenomenon that takes place in science and may have a very beneficial effect on science. Okay, because it has to do with specialization. So he started to understand scientific revolutions not as breaks within a particular field, but as episodes of speciation when new fields are born, and so on. And some historians, Hannah Anderson, who is going to be with us tomorrow, Peter Barker, Sang Chen, have done historical work using that framework to understand, the Copernican revolution or the revolution in nuclear physics in the 20th century, or the optical revolution in the 19th century, and so on. So I think, I have to say that, I mean, it's pretty much obvious, but I have to say it explicitly, that I'm a huge fan of Kuhn's work. I think he was seriously, heavily misrepresented in the 60s and 70s, misunderstood actually. And only recently, we have started to come to terms with, the richness and depth of that work. And I still find it relevant to much of what is going on in both history and philosophy of science. So it's not just structure. There is a lot that goes beyond structure, and all kinds of interesting epistemological and historiographical topics that in which, or for which, Kuhn had a lot to say.
And if I may, I'll ask a very brief follow-up to a follow-up I just raised. And it's this, would you expect, I mean, in some corners of HPS, this is already happening, but would you expect that?
Andre, excuse me for interrupting, but there was your connection. I don't know if it was just my problem or other people had the same problem, but I missed part of your question.
Oh, I see. Allow me to rehash it. I was wondering if you might expect that more and more, even in a Kuhnian vein, even ideas of Hempel's might be recaptured. And so would that in any way be denouncing or a sort of distancing from Kuhn's initial own attitude? Or so for instance, one idea that's key to Hempel is the idea of imposing mathematical structure to models of data. And obviously there's a context, there's a history, there's a set of practices that's associated with when imposing mathematical structure is useful or is deemed to be fruitful. And so this again seems to be a kind of Kuhnian re-evaluation, reassessment of basically Hempelian ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So would you think that
Yeah.
we might follow Kuhn better in departing from him?
In departing from him in the direction that Hempel's work, or who knows, shows, or I'm not, I mean, to be specific about Hempel, we may have to, no, before going to Hempel, excuse me, we may have to depart from Kuhn in many ways. I don't deny that, but I think it's a good starting point for many issues. Okay, this doesn't mean that, you know, we should slavishly follow him, and there are limitations in his work, obviously, but but it's worth engaging with his work, and even from a historiographical point of view, not just from a philosophical point of view. When it comes to Hempel, I'm familiar with his work on explanation and on concept formation, but not with other aspects of his work. So I would be hesitant to answer in a yes or no fashion. Some of his work on concept formation, I think, is still interesting, and actually Kuhn himself refers to it in a very positive way. So Hempel, instead of, you know, using the familiar theoretical observational distinction when it comes to scientific terms, he replaced that with a distinction between antecedently understood terms and novel terms that are introduced, you know, against the background of antecedently understood terms, and that was a very useful distinction, and Kuhn himself acknowledged that. So I know I'm not answering your question, and this has something to do with, or a lot to do with, my limited knowledge of Hempel's philosophy of science.
Well, I'm sure that's out of misplaced modesty, but thanks so much for And if there are no more questions or comments or rejoinders, please join me once again in wholeheartedly thanking Professor Arabatzis for his talk.
You are most welcome. Thank you so much for having me here.